Struggling to set up a secure and efficient wireless LAN? Whether you're using a WLAN controller or standalone APs, configuring a wireless network can feel like a maze. In this video, I'll walk you through the entire process, from setting up a radius server to configuring WLAN security and QoS. By the end, you'll know how to create a robust wireless network that's both secure and high-performing. Ready to master wireless LAN configuration? Let's dive in. Configure a wireless LAN. A wireless LAN controller and an access point work together to provide network connectivity to wireless clients. On the wireless side, the access point announces an SSID to the client who wants to join the network. And on the wired side, the controller connects to a VLAN using one of its dynamic interfaces. To establish a link between the SSID and the VLAN, a WLAN must be defined on the controller. The main objective of the CCNA, on the Wi-Fi part, requires the configuration of a WLAN with secure client connectivity in WPA2. And this is done using only the controller's GUI. This is what we will detail right away, based on the diagram. The controller will bind the WLAN to one of its interfaces and then send the WLAN configuration to all of its access points. And that's how wireless customers will be able to join the BSS. As with VLANs, it is possible to use WLANs to separate wireless users. And that way, users associated with a particular WLAN will not be able to travel on another WLAN unless the traffic is routed from one VLAN to another through the cable network infrastructure. As a general rule, it is best to limit the number of WLANs to a maximum of 5, or even 3, because they are very talkative. Because, since each WLAN is linked to a BSS, well, it will have to announce its own tags. And these tags are normally sent multiple times per second. This means that the more WLANs you create, the more tags you will need to announce them. The real problem is that clients will have a hard time transmitting their own data, as the channel will be busy with beacon transmissions that come from the access point. By default, a controller has a very limited basic configuration, which means that no WLAN is defined. Before creating a new WLAN, you need to think about 3 parameters: SSID, the controller interface and VLAN number, and the type of security, wireless. The following steps were performed using a web browser session that is connected to the IP address that manages the controller. Step 1. Configure a radius server. To start, we're going to set up a radius authentication server for our controller to add a layer of security. To declare the radius server on the controller, you have to go to Security and then select Authentication on the left tab. If you have multiple authentication servers defined, then the controller will attempt to join them in sequential order, i.e., from top to bottom. To add a new server, click on the New button at the top right. And here's the configuration of the radius server, which already exists on the topology. We will therefore report the IP address of the server, the secret key, and the port number, as can be seen in the image. You need to make sure that the server state is enabled. And you can also check the network user and management boxes to authenticate customers or administrators to access the controller's management features. For the example, I use the packet tracer simulator, which does not support all possible configurations of the controller. That's why you see gray areas. Step 2. Create a dynamic interface. Now let's move on to the second step, which is creating a dynamic interface. We've already covered the different types of controller interfaces. A dynamic interface is used to connect the controller to a VLAN on the wired network. When you create a WLAN, you need to link the dynamic interface and therefore the VLAN, to a wireless network. To create this new interface, you have to go to Controller and then to Interfaces. This shows us the list of all the controller interfaces that are currently configured. We can also see that there are two interfaces to declare: one management interface and one virtual interface. To define a new interface, you have to click on the New button. Then you just have to indicate a name for the interface and a VLAN number. In the example, the interface will be called Marketing and will be mapped to VLAN 99. To then get to the network configuration of the interface, you have to validate the creation by applying the modifications. Right after, a new window appears, and it is on this one that you will have to enter IP address, the subnet mask, and the gateway address for the interface. You also need to define the primary and secondary DHCP server addresses, which the controller will use when relaying DHCP requests from clients bound to the interface. In the example, we can see that the named Marketing has been configured with IP address 192.168.110, the 255.255.255.iris subnet mask, the gateway .192.168.100.11, and the main DHCP server in 192.168.1.20. I couldn't set up a secondary DHCP because the packet tracer simulator doesn't support it. Finally, all that's left to do is apply the configuration. Step 3. Create a new WLAN. We will now create a new WLAN. For that, you just need click on WLANs. We see that the controller has no defined one. To create a new WLAN, select Create New and click the Go. You then have to define a profile name and the name that the SSID will have. In the example, I typed the name Marketing on both fields. To make things simple, the ID that we see just below the SSID is just a cue for the controller. All that remains is to apply the configuration to display a new page that will allow you to modify other parameters. Generally, this is the page to enable WLAN by ticking the Enable checkbox of the status. Next, you will need to link the controller interface to the WLAN. So by default, this is the management interface that is linked to the WLAN. We're going to change that and put the Marketing interface. Configuring WLAN security. We will now see the security settings. In the Security and Layer 2 tab, you can choose the type of security you want to set up. In the table, you can see the description of the different possible choices. For example, we will start with WPA plus WPA2 and check the WPA2 box to then select the AES encryption. The normal WPA and the TKIP encryption are rather to be avoided because they are outdated methods. We also enable PSK, which means that in the example, the WLAN will only allow personal WPA2 with pre-shared key authentication. And to use enterprise WPA2, then you would have to check the 802.1x option. In this case, 802.1x and EAP would be used to authenticate wireless clients on one or more Radius servers. In the image, we see the Radius authentication server, which we had configured just before. On 10.10.10.4, on port 1645, configuring WLAN QoS. We will now move on to the QoS tab, which allows you to configure the quality of service for the WLAN. By default, the controller will process all WLAN frames in best effort, i.e., silver mode. It is possible to change the quality of service by different modes. We have the platinum mode for the voice, the gold mode for video, the default silver mode that will process frames in the best possible way, and the bronze mode. Advanced WLAN settings. And to finish the tabs, from the WLAN part, we have the advanced settings. By default, client sessions with WLAN are limited to 1800 seconds, which is 30 minutes. Once the deadline has passed, the customer will have to re-authenticate. This option is configured with the Enable Session Timeout checkbox and the Timeout field. Finalizing the WLAN configuration. Once you have understood all the WLAN settings, all that remains is to apply them. The WLAN will be created and added to the controller configuration. In the image, you can see that the marketing WLAN has been added with the ID 1 and is activated to use it.